My stepmother attempted to charge me rent on my 18th birthday, but she was unaware that I was the legitimate owner of the house we shared. My mom died when I was only 4 years old, and the house belonged to my grandparents' parents. After Mom passed away, Dad didn't date for a long time. Sure, he had a few women when I was around 12, but nothing serious, just coffee dates and occasional dinners out while I stayed with a babysitter. However, everything changed when I turned 14. By that time, both of my grandparents had died as well, and it was just Dad and me in that large home when he said, "I want you to meet someone special." Sandra was tall and graceful. She had flawlessly styled blonde hair and manicured nails, but what really caught my eye were the two people standing behind her. Sandra said, "These are my kids." James, who is in his first year of college, and Melissa, who is 16, cornered me in the kitchen that same day and said, "Just because our parents are dating doesn't make us sisters or friends or whatever. Let's keep our distance." Things moved quickly after that, and within 6 months, Dad and Sandra were married and moved into our house. It was strange how quickly our large home suddenly felt cramped. It was as if the walls were closing in, amplifying the tension between us. I often found myself longing for the days when it was just our family, before all these changes turned our lives upside down. James took over the guest room, Melissa got the study that we turned into a bedroom, and Sandra's belongings seemed to multiply overnight, filling every available space. When Dad got his big promotion, he came home one evening practically bouncing with excitement, his tie loose around his neck and a huge grin on his face. "Regional sales director," he announced during dinner. Can you believe it? Sandra immediately started talking about buying a new car and renovating the kid, but I was stuck on the part where Dad was happy. The bathroom situation became a nightmare, either because Sandra was in there doing her hour-long beauty routine, or Melissa was hogging it for her endless selfie sessions. I started getting up an hour earlier just to make sure I could shower before school, but I didn't complain when I saw how happy he was every time Sandra entered the room, or when he started humming while making breakfast. The first time Dad left, for a business trip, Sandra's attitude changed like a switch being flipped. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, she turned to me and said, "Stern, we need to establish some ground rules while your father is away." The ground rules turned out to be a lengthy list of chores and restrictions, and I had to be home by 4:30 p.m. Sharp. There are no exceptions, not even for study groups or school-related activities. However, I have volleyball practice on Thursdays, so I objected. Sandra quickly responded, "You'll have to quit." The first few days were difficult. I would race home from school, hardly having time to catch my breath before Sandra began giving commands, saying things like, "The floors need to be mopped, the windows are dirty, Ruby needs to start chopping the vegetables for dinner, Ruby." In the meantime, Melissa would sprawl on the couch with her phone in hand, laughing at whatever her latest boyfriend had texted. James was rarely home, but when he was, he would leave his laundry and dishes in the sink and let someone else do it. One evening, as Melissa was watching TikTok videos at full volume, I finally said, "Why doesn't Melissa have to help with any of this?" Sandra's head snapped up from her magazine. "She needs to focus on her college preparations. She can't waste time on housework," I said, glancing at Melissa, who was now filming her dancing. Definitely not studying anything. Chores, or the unfair treatment, it was the way Sandra would completely change every time Dad called or came home. She would put on this exhausted act, slumping in her chair and letting out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, honey, you have no idea how hard it's been," she would say when Dad came in the door, managing the house alone and taking care of everything. Dad would then, sweetly and obliviously, kiss her forehead and pull out a gift from his trip, like a designer handbag, pricey perfume, or jewelry that probably cost more than all of my possessions combined. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she would say as she preened and showed Melissa her most recent gift. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she would say as I stood there in the background, my hands raw from cleaning, homework still, waiting to be finished, watching this performance. Sometimes I caught Melissa grinning at me from behind her phone, but I kept my mouth shut, wondering what the point was. Of saying anything, Dad was content, successful, and in love. The years passed quickly, and before I knew it, I was in my senior year of high school. James had graduated from college 2 years prior, but he was still living at home, claiming he was searching for the right opportunity. He primarily did this by playing video games in his room and occasionally going on interviews that, for some reason, never worked out. Melissa was in her 3rd year at the local college, which meant she was also still at home. maintaining her reign over the bathroom and continuing her tradition of never lifting a finger. When my 18th birthday arrived in the early spring, I didn't have high expectations because Sandra had made it clear that a big celebration wasn't required. We would just have a small family dinner, she announced, not bothering to check her phone. Whole different story. A rented venue, professional catering, a DJ, and roughly 100 guests Sandra had spent weeks organizing to make sure everything was perfect. Dad was home for my birthday dinner, at least, but he left for another business trip the following day. He said, "Sorry, princess," hugging me, "goodbye, duty calls, and we'll celebrate properly when I get back." I then focused on getting ready for graduation, finishing college applications, ordering my cap and gown, and doing the typical senior year activities. Everything seemed normal until that dinner, which took place about a week after Dad left, and Melissa and I were seated around the table. She cleared her throat, Ruby, and folded her hands on the table. I perked up, thinking maybe she wanted to talk about my plans for college. I had been avoiding the subject with her, but perhaps she was finally showing some interest in my future, now that I was 18. She went on, "You're legally an adult, and adults have responsibilities. Starting next month, you'll need to pay $500 per month. Seems fair." I choked on my mouthful of food as I looked around the table and noticed that Melissa and Jess were both grinning and obviously enjoying the show. "What happens if I can't pay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, and Sandra's smile widened. "Well, then you'll need to find somewhere else to live, won't you? We can't have freeloaders in this house." I sat at the dinner table, my food now completely cold. Sandra's words hung in the air. The unfairness of it all. The years of being treated like a servant while her kids lounged around. And now something inside me, finally. "Let me clarify," I said in a surprisingly calm voice, that James, who graduated from college 2 years ago and spends his days playing video games, doesn't have to pay rent. Melissa, who is in her 3rd year of college and has never done a single chore in this house, also doesn't have to pay rent. But I do. Maybe it was all the years of pent-up frustration, or perhaps it was just time for the truth to come out, because I felt myself smile, not my usual attempt to maintain peace. But something different caused Sandra's own smile to falter a little. "That's interesting," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I won't be paying rent because this is my house." The silence that followed was deafening, and James began laughing. Sandra joined Melissa in her high-pitched giggle, but her laugh had a hint of sarcasm. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "This house belongs to me." I repeated, not breaking eye contact. She said, "Because my grandparents put it in my name before they passed away." Sandra's face went through a range of emotions, including amusement, confusion, disbelief, and finally something approaching panic. "That's ridiculous," she spluttered, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling your father right now," she said, her manicured nails tapping aggressively at the screen. "Hello, Dad," she said, through the speaker. "Hello, Dad," David S. Raw's tightly controlled voice crackled through the speaker. "Ruby is telling some interesting stories about the house that she claims belongs to me, but that's not true, right?" The silence on the other end seemed to go on forever. Dad cleared his throat a little bit, and my in-laws actually put it in Ruby's name before they left. "How could you not tell me this?" "I didn't think it was important." Dad said it weakly, and Sandra's face was turning an interesting shade of red. "It wasn't relevant that your teenage daughter owns our house," and she hung up before Dad could respond, almost tossing her phone onto the table. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and James and Melissa were staring at me as if they had never seen me before. Sandra took several deep breaths, and when she finally spoke, her voice was artificially bright, but I could hear it trembling a little. She said, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a hiccup, "This has all been a big misunderstanding. Of course. You don't have to pay rent, Ruby." I was about to head downstairs for breakfast when I heard Sandra's voice floating up from the living room. Her tone was hushed but intense. "David, you need to do something about this situation," she was saying. "Your daughter can't just let us get her to leave." And I froze on the stairs, holding my breath to hear better. I knew it was her house, but Sandra's frustration was still evident in her voice. This entire conversation happened without a word, so I got up and left the kitchen and headed for the stairs. By 6 a.m. the following morning, I was already awake, staring at my ceiling and thinking about how everything had changed in just a few hours. Things are tough. She doesn't belong here anymore. She's turning into a problem. There was a pause as Dad spoke, and even from where I was standing, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. However, it's Sandra's home, and no one is discussing kicking her out. Sandra's voice took on the syrupy, sweet tone she used when she was manipulating someone. What about the colleges she applied to? The ones in other states? You could encourage her to attend one of those and tell her that it would be good for her. Independence. My stomach nodded as I heard Dad's response. Perhaps you're right. I'll talk to her about moving away for college. It might be better for everyone. I waited until Sandra hung up before entering the kitchen, keeping my face neutral, and busied myself with a bowl and some cereal while feigning not to hear anything. James, Melissa, and Sandra shuffled in shortly after, both of them appearing as though they'd prefer to be somewhere else. Sandra swept in last, her phone still in hand, and said, "Good morning, everyone," as if last night had never happened. Then, as casually as if I were making a comment about the weather, I said, "By the way, starting next month, you'll all need to start paying rent." Sandra's piece of toast stopped halfway to her mouth, and Melissa's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Excuse me." Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. I repeated, taking another bite of my cereal, and I'm thinking, "Fairy." Sandra's face turned pale, then red, and she coughed evidently after inhaling some coffee. "You can't be serious, but I'm very serious. But our family doesn't charge family rent, so that's not how things work." Sandra sputtered, losing her composure, and said, "Set down your coffee cup," with a sharp click against the table. Sandra's face flushed, and I asked, still remaining calm, "That's different. I was trying to teach you about financial literacy to prepare you for the real world, and I couldn't help but laugh at that." "Listen," James started, but I interrupted him. "You graduated college 2 years ago. You don't have a job, so you spend all day playing video games and eating food that I help pay for with your part-time job. Perhaps it's time for you to learn about financial literacy as well." Sandra's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is revenge. You're just a spiteful, cruel child who's jealous of my children paying rent." Melissa scoffed, finally finding her voice. "What are you going to do to kick us out of the house?" James joined in, standing up so quickly that his chair fell. Sandra's voice was rising after everything I've done for this family. "What exactly have you done?" I asked, genuinely curious. "And you made me do all the housework while your kids did nothing. I heard everything, and you were listening, and I heard everything. Backward. After we welcomed you into our family, your family, I remained calm even as they all began yelling, 'This is my house, my grandparents' house. You're the ones who moved in here. Remember, you'll regret this.' I watched in silence as they thundered up the stairs. Sandra paused at the doorway, turning back to me with venomous eyes. "You'll pay for this," she spat, "and your father will hear about everything." I just sat there, finishing my now soggy cereal, while the sound of drawers slamming and irate muttering came from upstairs. Within an hour, they had thrown some bags together and were stomping out the front door. Sandra didn't even bother to close it behind her, just stormed out to her car with James and Melissa in tow. Strange in its newfound silence, I wandered from room to room, straightening things they'd left askew in their hurried departure, trying to process everything that had happened. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that my phone rang and my dad's name flashed across the screen. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hello. What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice exploded through the speaker, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Sandra just called me in hysterics, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear because something inside of me snapped after years of trying to keep the peace, staying quiet, and being the good daughter. I cut him off in his rant. "That's interesting. Dad, where was all this concern about cruelty when your wife tried to charge me rent for living in my own house? Did you think that was kind?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Dad spoke again, his voice was quieter, unsure of what you're doing. Talking about Sandra, my voice was trembling. "Now don't you dare act as though you didn't hear me on the phone with her this morning, Dad, when she was trying to persuade you to force me to move out, and you agreed to it." The silence that followed was so deafening that I could almost see him writhing, as he always did when caught in a lie. "Ruby, honey, you're ruining this family." And suddenly his voice hardened again. I sank down on the couch, the same couch where Melissa used to sprawl for hours while I did my fair share of housework. "She threatens to divorce me unless I apologize for having my own home and for standing up for myself. That's what you want, to ruin my marriage." I looked around the living room at the pictures of Sandra's family on the walls, mostly with just one small picture of Mom still tucked away in the corner. When I spoke again, my voice was steady, and he hung up on me. My graduation day passed by in a blur, but the empty seats in the family section felt like a physical weight on my chest. My best friend Sarah's parents took pictures of us together and invited me to their celebration dinner. They didn't mention my family's obvious absence, but their hugs lasted a little longer than usual. I spent the next few days going through college acceptance letters, trying to figure out what to do. The house felt peaceful and empty until a familiar car pulled into the driveway one afternoon. Dad got out first, followed by Sandra James, and I met them at the door before they could knock. They were all dressed up and wearing identical stern expressions, and instead of visiting family, they appeared to be going to a business meeting, Ruby's father said in a formal tone, and Sandra stood just behind his shoulder, nodding encouragingly, as if she was pulling the strings. "We've come to settle this," and I leaned against the doorframe, waiting. He continued to choose his words, carefully saying, "We can all move back in and things can go back to normal, but you need to apologize to Sandra and her children for how you treated them." Naturally, he dropped the ridiculous idea about rent. I looked at each of their faces, and as the dad's forced smile and Sandra's smug expression, I remembered countless nights spent doing their chores while being treated like a servant. Sandra gasped dramatically as I said, "That's your choice, Dad. You've made it clear you choose your wife and her children over your own daughter, just like you've been doing for years." I pulled out my phone and threatened to call the police for harassment, which shut her up quickly. Dad then began gathering the few belongings he'd left behind, working in intense silence. No one spoke as he packed his belongings into boxes and carried them to the car. I'm writing this from my dorm room at Northwestern University, which is more than 1,000 miles from home. Anderson Real Estate is managing the house, and they found good tenants, a young family with 2 young girls, and the rental income more than covers my college expenses and allows me to focus on my studies without worrying about money. I've heard tidbits about Dad from mutual friends. He's renting a 3-bedroom apartment across town with a fancy title and good salary. Sandra got the renovation she always wanted, new granite countertops and stainless steel appliances in someone else's kitchen. James finally found a job, though I hear he still lives at home. They're living their lives, and I'm living mine. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I look at old pictures from before Mom passed away, when Dad's smile came to his eyes and family meant something different. I wonder if we'll ever be father and daughter again, if he ever thinks about me, if he regrets his decisions, and if he misses me the way I miss him. Maybe one day Dad will realize what he lost and we'll figure out a way to mend our relationship. Either way, I'm stronger than I ever imagined possible.